Our gospel today is pretty famous. It's so famous that everybody pretty much knows that line, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few." And it's fairly clear that the passage was written, at least in part, to encourage Jesus' followers to get out there into the world and, well, harvest. But harvest what? This past week or so, I've noticed some people standing in front of the post office. I don't know if you've seen them too. Always a pair. And they're out there, just like the gospel says, proclaiming their message. But what message? And to what end? What exactly are they planting and what will they harvest? Because as Paul says in today's epistle, you reap whatever you sow. So what are they sowing? This is always a little trickier than you think when you look at it a little deeper. So maybe we should look at the situation in today's gospel just a little more closely. Now, Jesus and his disciples are probably at this point in the gospel parked somewhat north of Jerusalem, possibly still in Samaria, because as you remember from last week, they were in Samaria last week, right? But certainly well north of Jerusalem. If they are in the land of the Samaritans, then they are among people who do believe in God, but don't use all the same scriptures and don't believe that the temple is the center of worship. That's one of the reasons why in last week's gospel they didn't receive them, because they were headed to Jerusalem. They're always headed to Jerusalem in Luke's gospel. This week, which is just a little bit beyond in the gospel itself, this week Jesus sends out 70 of the disciples to do the same thing, which is to say, to go out into the villages and prepare for his arrival. It doesn't say exactly what villages, but we have to assume that it's probably in both Samaria and Judea. But what does he tell them to do? Once they go there, what are they supposed to do? What is their message? The message is to cure the sick and to say to them, the kingdom of God has come near. You will notice that the message is the same whether they receive them or not. The only difference is if they don't receive them, then they don't cure the sick. But even then, they wipe off the dust off their feet and say, know this, the kingdom of God has come near. That's the message. So, is that our message? Is this what Jesus is asking of us? That we cure the sick and simply let people know that the kingdom is near? That's certainly not what those folks in front of the post office were doing. I got to look at some of the literature. And what they are doing is warning passersby that if they don't accept Christ, they will go to hell. Perhaps a better question is, what are we doing? And to what end? What are you and I doing to obey this command of Jesus to go out and to proclaim? Are we telling people that God will destroy them if they don't convert? Now, I'm not just talking about this, folks, in front of the post office. This has actually been a practice among Christians for hundreds and hundreds of years, to force others into conversion, often under the threat of death. Even in the last century in America, many churches, including, I'm afraid, ours, had the practice of removing Native American children from their homes and literally beating out of them their culture and the religion they grew up with so that they could be saved. And I wonder, would that harvest really be what Christ seeks? Or would it be a harvest of terrified and angry people who follow only under duress? Now, that's not us, of course. We wouldn't do that. We're friendly and welcoming, right? But here's a question. Are we asking people to come and be a part of our church so that we can share God's love? Or so that we can put more people in the pews, and bump up the numbers and increase the pledge and get people to join our committees? Would that be the harvest that God seeks? Or would it lead to a group who are burnt out and resentful? Now, there's no doubt that there are an awful lot of people in the world, in our country, whose lives will improve enormously if they truly encounter the risen Christ, whose lives can be made whole again, whose souls can be brought back and put back on the path toward the kingdom of God. There are roughly 350 million people in this country. 25% of them declare themselves to be either atheist or agnostic. 75% of them profess some level of belief, though not necessarily affiliation to any particular religion and not necessarily any desire to ever go to a church. It's a lot of people. And the one thing we know is this: 100% of them are beloved children of God. And 100% of them are ripe to hear or experience God's love in action. Whether they are regulars in church on Sunday or they've never seen one before. But if we assume today's gospel is telling us to not merely put up a sign that says, "The Episcopal Church welcomes you," then what are we to proclaim? And how? Because we can't pretend that there's just one simple answer to this, one way to do it. Certainly, Christ expects us, if we are truly His followers, to get out of this building and to proclaim. Not, I would suggest, by standing in front of the post office and holding pictures of eternal fire, but certainly to the people God puts in our paths, and with whatever means we have available to us. Yesterday, for example, a group of us took part in one of the worship walks. It was just over there at the Vanderbilt estate. We were pretty low-key about it. We simply stopped and prayed, and we walked, and then we stopped and prayed and walked, and we did this for a while until we got to the Eucharist. And we stopped at the Italian Gardens, pulled out our little package, a little chalice, the platen, put on my stole. Didn't occur to me till after that maybe I shouldn't have wine in a national park, but never mind. It was only that much. But when we got to the Italian Garden and we set up, and we used the wall as an altar, we gathered around it, I could see people sort of slowing down as they're walking and sort of peeking in and listening to what we were saying. And it was a special Eucharist because we were celebrating God's call for us to be stewards of creation. And when you do that, when you're a visible sign, and you're saying something, and others are simply peeking in and listening in, then the kingdom is being proclaimed. Or lately, I've taken to spending about an hour or so a week at Cranberries. Now, this is nothing new. I've been spending an hour to a week at Cranberries for years. So many years, in fact, that they've started to call it St. James Annex. However, lately, I've taken to putting this sign up on the table where I sit. I sit down there in my collar, and I put this little sign in. If you can't see it, it says, "Free Prayer." And I just read, or I work on my laptop. And it's a funny thing, because when I first did this, stealing an example from a Lutheran pastor I met, I was terrified. First of all, that nobody would notice it. And second of all, that Roger over at Cranberries would probably throw me out. But mostly, I was afraid that somebody would notice it and would say something. And you know what? Somebody did. They came up and they said, "I see that sign. Can we talk?" I've done this 3 times now. And every time, someone has come up and said, "I see that sign. Can we talk? Will you pray with me?" This week, a mother and her daughter came up and they were visiting the aunt and sister who was in Ferncliff. They were visiting from Tennessee. And they said, "We don't know what's wrong with her, but she's not getting better. Can we just pray about that?" And we did. And then they gave me her name, and they said, "If you have some time, do you think maybe you can go visit her?" And I said, "I will." So we will do that. That is a small little thing. And I realize that this sort of thing won't work for everyone. But if you seek a way to bring healing and to proclaim the kingdom of God, you will find what works for you. So the short answer to the question, what is the harvest, is this. Every person on the earth is ripe to experience God's love. It doesn't matter if they are Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Sikh. They are God's beloved children, and they are ripe to experience God's love. It doesn't matter if it is at work or at a political rally or at a ball game or at the 4th of July parade or in prison or in a refugee camp. They are ripe to experience the love of God. Now, I don't want to take away from next week's sermon too much, but the passage right after this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know that story? You know, in it, this guy reaches across all political, religious, and cultural divisions, forget divisions, hatreds, to care for someone in need. But look at that parable. There's not really a word about God in it. But there's God all over the place in it, because He is showing God's love. So perhaps Jesus does not suggest that we beat people over the head with the Bible. But neither does He suggest that we simply put a sign that says, "Welcome." Neither does He suggest that we simply go out into the world and be nice people. The Good Samaritan wasn't just being a nice person. Anybody listening to that story at the time knew what a radical statement he was making to help someone who was injured but belonged to the wrong people. The harvest is plentiful, and the harvest is us, all of us. The 25% who believe nothing or don't know what they believe, and the 75% who profess and sometimes actually believe in God. And if we treat every single person as one who needs to experience God's love in word and deed, then we will bring that curing, that healing, and then we will bring the kingdom of God nearer. If we treat every single person as one who needs to experience God's love in word and deed, we will always harvest a world that is just a little bit better. Amen.